Welcome. How can we make rule-based systems better? Think of a complex rule-based system like trying to buy a new flat from the Singapore Housing Development Board. Take a look at the eligibility criteria. It's pretty complex. For example, there are rules on property ownership, citizenship requirements, etc. So in a traditional system, you have inputs, you have the system itself and outputs, and usually the input for a rule-based system is some sort of a structured document, typically a JSON or YAML document. And the system converts that input to an internal data structure, and it uses a series of if-then statements to craft the output. The challenge in a traditional system is actually managing the very complex web of if-then else statements. Think about which statements you can use to implement at least one Singapore citizen. You have to scan through the data structure, and at least one other Singapore citizen or permanent residents with conditions attached. Open Policy Agent's Rego policy language, their if structure is quite different. So if you take a trivial example, a traditional language if structure would be like that. If method is get and the URL is not secret, or the method is post and the URL is new customer, you allow, otherwise disallow. OPA's if structure is a bit strange. It took me a while to get used to it. Notice there are two allow rules. The default, if neither of these rules prove to be true, is to make allow false. This is how you read the rule. The allow rule is true if the method is get and, it's an implicit and, the URL is not secret. Or allow is true if method is post and the URL is new customer. The advantage of an OPA rule, Open Policy Agent rule, is it can return many different kinds of types. It can return Boolean, as we saw, a string, number, JSON array, or JSON object. So in this case, imagine a charity grant or research grant kind of application. If your income is less than $10, 10 units, the status grant is provided a status of approved, needy, and the amount is, let's say, 100 units or $100. However, if your income is less than 5 units, the status changes to approved, very needy, and the amount goes up to $200. It's denied if your income is 10 or greater. So the rule is assigned the appropriate value depending on the inputs. Now, if that is all OPA's Rego language can do, it's not very useful. It can actually scan the incoming input document. So in this case, we have two files, HDB criteria and HDB application. This is the policy and this is the input. So let's look at the input. The many applicants make up one application, and you have 3 applicants here. One is a PR, next citizen, and one other. So what does this rule say? This rule says there should be at least one Singapore citizen, otherwise the rule will prove false. The default is false. So let's run it first, and then we'll walk through what it does later. So let's copy this. And go to my terminal. We're in scan example, that's good. Let's paste that and run it. At least one citizen is true. Let's look at our input. Yes, there is one citizen there, and it found it in the second entry. So let's go back again. Input, data. Let's look at some of the things we glossed over. So input.applicants and data.hdb. So let's explain that. So OPA assigns the YAML, in this case it is a YAML document, to an internal global variable named input. That's why input.applicants. The OPA system consists of policies, which are .rego files, and possibly in other internal data, let's say the minimum age, in the form of JSON or YAML files. And it can also connect to external data connections, external databases. So for this evaluation run, the input is HTTP YAML. The policy is assigned to the data internal variable as this file. Please print the output. And my query, my question is, what is data.hdb? So the first line in a rego file, a policy file, is a package statement. And it says these set of policies belong to the package HDB for Housing Development Board. The package could also have a name like hdb.newflat.keys for policies relating to retrieving or getting the keys to your new flat. So that query, data.hdb, means exactly what it says. Tell me about the policy decisions made in the HDB package given this input and given this policy. And the answer is there is at least one citizen in the input. So what's the meaning of input applicants underscore? Well, this reads, if at least one citizen is undefined, that's the default statement, give it the default value of false. And if you can find in the applicant's array someone in the applicant's array whose residence status is citizen, then this line is true and the rule is given the true value. Otherwise it defaults to false. So the input applicants in this case, the first or the 0th applicant is a PR, the first applicant is a citizen, the second applicant is other. Now let's consider a more complex rule. At least 2 citizens or a citizen and a PR. Unsurprisingly, this rule is not too different from what we have seen before. The default is the rule proves to be false. If you don't say anything, it's false. So here we have a rule. We have 2 variables, some I and some j, which are index variables. If the applicant I has a residence status of citizen and the applicant j also is a citizen, and I is not equal to j, very important. That means there are 2 different entries. That means there are 2 people here and they are both citizens. This will flag to true. Similarly, almost the same, I is a PR and j is a citizen and I is not equal to j. This will also be true. So how do we test policies? Well, we create another rego file. By convention, we give it an underscore test extension, but it's in the same package HTTP. And we want to test, this is the test. The convention is it starts with a test underscore and the name of your test. I've just used the name of the rule, but it can be anything else. So this is the rule. At least 2 citizens or a citizen and a PR. If I change the input and I give it as this, now that looks like a JSON document because it is a JSON document. So here we see 2 applicants, both citizens, and it should pass. Here we have 3 applicants, 1 citizen, 1 other, and 1 PR. It should also pass. And finally, this is very important, not. It should not at least 2 citizens or citizen and PR. In other words, it should evaluate the false if you have this input, 2 PRs. There's no citizen there. So let's run the test. So if we run the test, let's do it for real. CD2 example. And let's copy this. OPA test, everything in this current directory. Give me a verbose result. Says it passed. Yay, good. Now, let's change the test fixture to purposely cause a failure. Let's see. We have HDB criteria and HDB criteria tests. We want to change the test to purposely fail. Okay, let's change the last one. We have a citizen and a PR and it should pass, but we say not there. We close it and let's run the test again. Wow, we've got a failure. But the failure is quite indicative. It points to exactly where in the file it failed and the input which caused the failure. So in this case, we had a citizen and a PR, and it says not data to citizens, citizen and PR. So that's a failure case. Let's fix that. This will also fail, but therefore it is not at least 2 citizens and a PR, so the test will pass. That's what I meant. And let's run the test again, and now the test passes. So how can Open Policy Agent be deployed? Well, it can be deployed as a standalone binary, that OPA binary, which I've been using. It's standalone. It's not very big. It's written in Go. It's actually also perfect as a sidecar container in a Kubernetes pod. And it can be deployed as a standalone container in some containerized environment. Finally, if you use Go, you can link OPA as a library. But the usual way to interact with OPA is with HTTP JSON calls to the OPA process. And that makes OPA language independent. And the only constraint being that it speaks JSON for input and for output. I plan to give a follow-up talk on using native functions written in OPA's own policy language Rego. So stay tuned for part 2. And meanwhile, if you want the source code and the code for this presentation, it's available at GitHub Xiuyin. Thank you.